The superiority of both systems, as they limited government and freed men, was widely acclaimed. The material prosperity of the latter part of the 19th century provided the framework within which the idea of progress gained sway over the minds of many in Europe, and especially in the United States. The idea of progress refers primarily to the belief that things are getting better generally, and, more broadly, that improvement with the passage of time is a virtual law of the universe. Much evidence appeared to support this belief in the latter part of the 19th century, particularly on the material side. New discoveries and inventions abounded. Sanitation and health facilities were clearly improving. Population was increasing, perhaps as never before in history. And people generally had the means for producing and had a greater variety of goods available than ever before. Indeed, this variety and abundance continued to increase into the 20th century, but before long other sorts of development began to cast doubt upon the universality of progress. The idea of progress was not new to the 19th century. It had been around since the 17th century at the latest, and more people championed it in the 18th century. Modern thinkers even ceased to believe that even the ancient Greeks were their superiors. The idea of progress was mightily bolstered by the material improvements and expansion of information in the 19th century, and by the 20th century was widely accepted by people generally. At its simplest level, it translated into the view that the latest is the best, or, as the French publicist of the 1920s, Émile Coué, put it, "Every day, in every way, we are getting better and better." By the 1920s, too, American automobile makers were taking advantages of the popular idea and bringing out new models annually, each year's model presumably an improvement over that of the preceding year. More deeply, the idea of progress got intellectual support from the idea of evolution, which gained sway in the 19th century. This was especially the case with the Darwinian conception of the survival of the fittest. If the fittest survive in the struggle for survival, it would appear to tend to make some sort of progress inevitable. In any case, the idea of progress enjoyed great vogue in the midst of the growth and expansion of America in the late 19th and early 20th century. Granted that the theme of growth is the dominant one in this book, however, there are a good many important sub-themes that emerge as well. New currents of ideas were emerging which would eventually challenge the dominant developments. Even as governments were being restricted and free men were demonstrating what they could do, the foundations of this order were coming under attack, and a new outlook was coming to the fore. If, as is sometimes claimed, the ideas of one century are applied in the next, then it should not surprise us that there were new currents in the 19th century that would sweep all before them in many lands in the 20th century. There is abundant evidence that this was the case. Moreover, new developments cast doubt on the progressive course of history. The 20th century was hardly underway before much of the world was locked in a titanic conflict which we call World War I. In its wake came a new despotism, totalitarian governments with all power concentrated in a central government, governments which used modern devices to spread the tentacles of power more deeply into the lives of people than had been the case in the past. The hallmarks of the 20th century have been unleashed government power, total war, concentration camps, vast propaganda efforts, and brainwashing by those in power, and government efforts to control everything both within and outside their borders. Another face of these developments has been government-engendered terrorism, both on their own peoples and those in other lands. Indeed, the seeds of such practices were sown in the 19th century. It is not too much to say that 19th century thinkers sowed the wind, and the 20th century has reaped the whirlwind. Looked at in one way, evolutionary theories gave great impetus to the idea of progress. But from another angle, they tended to undercut the very foundations of individual liberty, limited government, and the basis of freedom and responsibility. The theory of natural law was abandoned by some thinkers, and with it the natural rights on which individual rights were based in the United States. That does not necessarily mean that people ceased to believe in rights, but they tended to attribute them to other sources than nature and nature's God, usually government. A great wave of materialism swept through intellectual